Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 52 through 57, is one of the most difficult passages in all of Scripture. In it, Moses explains to the people what will happen if they choose to disobey God. He's already warned them that God will bring curses upon them, but these verses describe something that would have sent chills up their spines. The judgment of God was going to be so severe, and the ramifications of it so intense, that they would end up committing atrocities that were beyond their ability to comprehend. Moses tells them that when the city of Jerusalem comes under siege by the Babylonians, the people will end up starving and then resorting to cannibalism in order to survive. The self-destructive nature of sin was going to run its full course, producing a kind of barbarism among the people of God that was unthinkable, yet unavoidable. Failure to remain faithful to God was going to prove deadly, in more ways than one. They shall besiege you in all your towns, until your high and fortified walls, in which you trusted, come down throughout all your land. And they shall besiege you in all your towns throughout all your land, which the Lord your God has given you. And you shall eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your sons and daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you, in the siege and in the distress with which your enemies shall distress you. The man who is the most tender and refined among you will begrudge food to his brother, to the wife he embraces, and to the last of the children whom he has left, so that he will not give to any of them any of the flesh of his children whom he is eating, because he has nothing else left, in the siege and in the distress with which your enemy shall distress you in all of your towns. The most tender and refined woman among you, who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground because she is so delicate and tender, will begrudge to the husband she embraces, to her son and to her daughter, her afterbirth that comes out from between her feet, and her children whom she bears, because lacking everything she will eat them secretly, in the siege and in the distress with which your enemy shall distress you in your towns. Deuteronomy 28, verses 52 through 57. These are disturbing verses. Their content is graphic and difficult to comprehend, and it's essential that we not forget the context. The people of Israel are poised to enter the land of Canaan, and Moses has been addressing them for quite some time now. He has reiterated the law to them and reminded them of the blessings that will accompany obedience to God's commands. But he has also been warning them about the curses that will fall on them should they choose to rebel against God by disobeying his law. But in these verses, Moses describes some very disturbing scenes that had to have left the Israelites appalled and shaking their heads in disbelief. They could never have imagined these kinds of things happening among their people. The graphic nature of Moses' words would have been offensive and off-putting. Some probably accused Moses of resorting to scare tactics, using hyperbolic language in an attempt to goad them into fear-based compliance to God's law. The thought of these kinds of hideous things happening among them would have been impossible to comprehend or even consider. After all, Moses describes grotesque scenes of desperately hungry people resorting to cannibalism in order to keep from starving to death. The enemy has surrounded their city, creating a food shortage within its walls and leaving the inhabitants with nothing to eat and little hope of survival. And this scene will be taking place all throughout the land of Canaan as city after city comes under attack from a distant nation whom God will send against the people of Israel. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who will not respect the old or show mercy to the young. Deuteronomy 28, verses 49 through 50. Once again, as far-fetched as all of this may have sounded to the people of Israel, Moses was actually providing a God-ordained glimpse into the future. He was revealing what would actually take place when the Assyrians came against the northern kingdom of Israel, and hundreds of years later, when the Babylonians swept down on the southern kingdom of Judah. The dire circumstances Moses described would actually take place, and Moses would not be the only one to predict this unfathomable outcome. Hundreds of years later, the prophet Jeremiah would deliver the following warning from God to the people of Judah. And I will make this city a horror, a thing to be hissed at. Everyone who passes by it will be horrified and will hiss because of all of its wounds. And I will make them eat the flesh of their sons and their daughters, and every one shall eat the flesh of his neighbor in the siege and in the distress, with which their enemies and those who seek their life afflict them. Jeremiah 18, verses 8 through 9. The book of Lamentations predicts this same implausible outcome. Look, O Lord, and see, with whom have you dealt thus? Should women eat the fruit of their womb, the children of their tender care? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Lamentations 2, verse 20. And the prophet Ezekiel would provide additional proof of God's coming judgment. And because of all your abominations, I will do with you what I have never yet done, and the like of which I will never do again. Therefore fathers shall eat their sons in your midst, and sons shall eat their fathers. Ezekiel 5, verses 9 through 10. That these atrocities actually took place is beyond debate. The Jewish historian Josephus records that during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, the city's starving citizens resorted to eating their own children. He provides a detailed account of one such circumstance. Among the residents of the region beyond Jordan was a woman called Mary, daughter of Eleazar of the village of Bethuzeba. The name means house of hyssop. She was well off and of good family, and had fled to Jerusalem with her relatives, where she became involved with the siege. Most of the property she had packed up and brought with her from Perea had been plundered by the tyrants, Simon and John, leaders of the Jewish war effort. And the rest of her treasure, together with such foods as she had been able to procure, was being carried by their henchmen in their daily raids. In her bitter resentment, the poor woman cursed and abused these extortioners, and this incensed them against her. However, no one put her to death, either from exasperation or pity. She grew weary of trying to find food for her kinsfolk. In any case, it was by now impossible to get any, wherever you tried. Famine gnawed at her vitals, and the fire of rage was ever fiercer than famine. So, driven by fury and want, she committed a crime against nature. Seizing her child, an infant at the breast, she cried, "My poor baby, why should I keep you alive in this world of war and famine? Even if we live till the Romans come, they will make slaves of us, and anyway, hunger will get us before slavery does, and the rebels are crueler than both. Come, be food for me, and an avenging fury to the rebels, and a tale of cold horror to the world, to complete the monstrous agony of the Jews." With these words she killed her son, roasted the body, swallowed half of it, and stored the rest in a safe place. But the rebels were on her at once, smelling roasted meat and threatening to kill her instantly if she did not produce it. Josephus, The Jewish War. So there's little doubt that the words of Moses were far from idle threats. God was deadly serious and wanted his people to know that a disregard for his holy law would result in a breakdown of the social fabric of Israelite society that would be unimaginable and incomprehensible in scope. Josephus would go on to describe the scene that took place behind the walls of Jerusalem as an act unparalleled in the history of either the Greeks or the barbarians, and as horrible to relate as it is incredible to hear. The curses of God would render every man and woman into selfish and self-protective beasts whose only concern was their own personal survival. Love of God and love of others would be the farthest thing from their minds. But the thought of killing and consuming their own child was beyond the comprehension of Moses' audience. Yet the judgment of God against the repeated rebellion of his people would be so severe that the unthinkable would become commonplace. What was once immoral would become acceptable and unavoidable. The Israelites, who at one time had enjoyed special status as God's chosen people, would eventually become guilty of committing some of the most heinous and morally repugnant acts ever committed by humanity. And as Moses has pointed out, it will begin with their decision to disobey the commands of God. The tender and refined among them would become the cold-hearted and callous. Rebellion against God is a downward spiral with a trajectory that is difficult to reverse. And these mind-boggling, sensibility-shocking descriptions of the once law-abiding Israelites resorting to cannibalism may be difficult to comprehend, but they would be the unavoidable outcome of a willful choice to reject the will of God by disobeying the law of God.